You wake up, check your phone, scroll, react. Someone's already told you what to feel before you've had your first thought. You're not thinking, you're responding. And that's the beginning of a controlled mind. Carl Jung didn't just study human psychology. He exposed its darkest vulnerabilities. He believed most people don't live lives. They live scripts. Scripts written by parents, society, religion, governments, influencers, and voices they can't even identify anymore. And the scariest part? They defend these scripts as if they wrote them themselves. When Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate," he wasn't being poetic. He was giving a warning. Most people aren't in control of their minds. They're just reacting to what's been implanted. They feel what they were trained to feel. They desire what they were programmed to want. They suffer in patterns they never chose. Ever wonder why you feel guilty when you say no? Why you feel anxious when you speak up? Why silence in a room feels like pressure? Why choosing yourself feels wrong? Because your mind has been conditioned to obey. From the moment you were a child, tiny punishments and rewards started shaping you. Smile? Good girl. Obey? Gold star. Stay quiet? Respectful. But cry too loud? Selfish. Say no? Rude. Rebel? Problem child. What started as parenting became programming. You were trained not to think, but to please. Not to question, but to fit in. As adults, we carry this invisible leash, tugged by approval, validation, and fear of rejection. We think we're making choices. But Jung would ask, whose voice are you hearing inside your head when you hesitate? Your own? Or the ghost of someone else? Here's what the controlled mind looks like. You overthink every decision because you're terrified of judgment. You seek permission to be happy. You shrink yourself to be accepted. You perform roles that exhaust you and call that being a good person. You're stuck in survival mode while calling it love, loyalty, and responsibility. Jung saw that the mind isn't controlled by force anymore. It's controlled by invisibility, by what we don't notice, by what we believe without question, by what society has normalized as truth. The most dangerous chains are the ones you can't see. And those chains? They don't look like oppression. They look like expectations. They sound like, "You're too much. You shouldn't think like that. That's not normal. Why can't you just be happy?" Jung's darkest theory was this: a person can be completely imprisoned by their own mind without ever realizing they're not free. Because once the outside world enters your psyche, you'll think its voice is yours. And that's why healing feels like rebellion, like guilt, like loneliness. Because when you finally try to think for yourself, everything trained into you fights back. Think about it. You don't fear being wrong. You fear being different. You don't fear change. You fear disapproval. You don't fear solitude. You fear losing belonging. That's not your mind. That's someone else's hand still turning the steering wheel. The world teaches you to doubt your feelings, question your instincts, silence your intuition. It teaches you to conform, to flatten yourself into something palatable, predictable, manageable. Then it praises you for being mature, polite, well-behaved. What they really mean is, thanks for not being dangerous. Thanks for staying controlled. But Jung knew every mind has a wild part, a shadow, a fire, the part that refuses to be tamed, the part that asks, what if everything I've been told is a lie? That part, that's you. That's the real you. And that's exactly what they've tried to bury. You were never argued into obedience. You were emotionally shaped into it. Carl Jung understood something terrifying. The human mind is programmed not through logic, but through emotional repetition. No one needed to explain why you shouldn't cry too loud, laugh too hard, or question adults. They just had to punish you emotionally. Ignore a child when they speak up, and they learn that silence is safer. Mock a child when they express a feeling, and they learn that emotion is weakness. Reward them only when they obey, and they begin to believe obedience is love. And by the time you grow up, you're no longer afraid of people. You're afraid of feelings. Society doesn't control you with force. It controls you with emotional association. Pain equals punishment. Guilt equals morality. Anxiety equals disobedience. Shame equals correction. You don't ask questions because you're stupid. You avoid them because somewhere along the line, asking made you feel unsafe. That's the controlled mind. It doesn't need fences. It builds its own cage. You think you're making free choices. But let's test that. When you say yes to people you want to say no to, is that kindness or fear? When you stay in a relationship that drains you, is that love or programming? When you smile through pain so others aren't uncomfortable, is that strength or survival? Jung would say, emotion unexamined becomes behavior repeated. And that's how they got you. They didn't convince you with truth. They conditioned you with fear. If they make you feel guilty every time you say, I need space, eventually you'll stop asking. If they make you feel ungrateful every time you express pain, eventually you'll call your trauma normal. And once enough of these emotional buttons are embedded in your psyche, you'll live your entire adult life trying not to press them. That's not freedom. That's internalized control. Now here's the real trick. They trained you to fear your own liberation. Try saying no. You'll feel selfish. Try taking rest. You'll feel lazy. Try speaking up. You'll feel like a problem. Try walking away. You'll feel like a villain. That's the emotional virus Jung warned us about. If healing feels like guilt, if truth feels like betrayal, if boundaries feel like abandonment, then congratulations. you're not free. You're emotionally imprisoned. Carl Jung explored this in his work with the shadow. He believed that everything you were trained to reject, anger, sadness, defiance, doubt, gets pushed into your unconscious mind. And once it's unconscious, it begins to control you. So you live in a constant loop. Obey, suppress, please, shrink, repeat. And every time you try to break the pattern, you don't just face resistance from others, you face resistance from within, because your emotions were hijacked. And now, your jailer is your own nervous system. Let's look at this in real life. A child grows up with emotionally unpredictable parents. Love feels conditional. Safety is rare. The child learns, if I'm perfect, I'll be safe. Now that child grows up. They become the high achiever, the people pleaser, the overthinker. They never question why they can't relax, because their emotional memory says, stillness equals danger, disapproval equals threat. And so, they confuse burnout for love. They confuse performance for safety. They confuse control for peace. This is not a lifestyle. It's a trauma adaptation. And if it goes unexamined, it becomes your identity. Jung said, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. In other words, you will either feel the original pain or live your entire life trying to avoid it. But here's the paradox. You can't heal what you refuse to feel. You can't break the script if you still call it personality. The mind that's controlled by emotional fear will always choose the familiar cage over the unknown door. So if you've ever wondered, why do I feel guilty for choosing myself? Why do I fear success? Why do I replay old conversations? Why do I shrink when I should speak? It's not because you're broken. It's because you were trained. And training can be unlearned, but only if you're willing to face the feelings you were taught to bury. You wake up one day and think, why do I always mess things up just when they start going right? You're not lazy. You're not weak. You're trained to sabotage your own freedom. Carl Jung saw this pattern again and again. When someone gets too close to healing, too close to truth, their own mind rebels. Not because it hates them, but because it was conditioned to survive in dysfunction. And survival doesn't care about happiness. It only cares about familiarity. Let's say you grew up in chaos. Unpredictable love, harsh criticism, inconsistent safety. Your nervous system learns chaos is normal. So later in life, when you meet peace, it feels suspicious. When someone treats you kindly, it feels foreign. When life gets calm, you stir up drama. When you're given freedom, you choose cages that look like comfort. That's not your personality. That's a nervous system stuck in survival mode. Jung called this the inner saboteur, a hidden part of your psyche that protects you, even if it has to destroy you to do it. It doesn't believe you're allowed to be happy. so it sabotages peace. It doesn't believe you're allowed to be seen, so it sabotages visibility. It doesn't believe you're safe unless you're small, so it sabotages every moment you try to grow. And worst of all, it uses your own voice to do it. Thoughts like, "You're not good enough. You'll embarrass yourself. You don't deserve this. They'll leave if they see the real you." They don't come from truth. They come from emotional echoes, from the first time someone made you feel unworthy. Those voices didn't originate in your head. They were planted there, and over time, you mistook them for your own. Carl Jung believed that healing requires confrontation. You must face your inner saboteur, not hate it, not destroy it, but understand why it exists. Because it's not evil. It's protective. It's the little child version of you, still trying to keep you safe, using old methods in a new world. It's the child who learned that authenticity leads to rejection, so it wears a mask for survival. It's the child who learned that rest leads to punishment, so it runs itself to exhaustion. It's the child who learned that needs are burdens, so it shuts down every time it wants something real. And that child lives inside every adult who's still people-pleasing, overthinking, doubting, shrinking, numbing. Jung saw this clearly. Until you meet the part of yourself that sabotages you, you'll never know the part of yourself that could free you. That's shadow work. Not affirmations, not motivation, but excavation. Digging up what you buried, facing what you fled, and loving the part of you that still doesn't believe it's lovable. Here's a real example. A man grows up with parents who only praise achievement. Every "I'm proud of you" was tied to marks, medals, or milestones. As a child, he learns, "I am only valuable when I succeed." So as an adult, he becomes a perfectionist, a workaholic, a productivity machine. But every time he slows down, he panics. Every time he rests, he feels worthless. Every time he fails, he spirals into shame. Not because he loves work, but because his saboteur believes that success equals safety. And anything that threatens that belief feels like death, even peace. And now comes the scariest part. The more you try to change, the louder your sabotage becomes. Start setting boundaries? Your mind floods with guilt. Start expressing emotions? Your mind whispers, "You're too much." Start leaving toxic patterns. Your mind screams, "You're making a mistake." This is not failure. This is proof that your system is shifting. The saboteur fights hardest right before the breakthrough. So what do? You listen. Not to obey, but to understand. You track your inner patterns. You ask, where did I first learn this fear? Whose voice does this sound like? What am I trying to protect myself from? Is this truth? Or is this trauma speaking? And then, most importantly, you choose something different, even if it terrifies you, even if it feels like loss, even if your mind says it's wrong. Because the controlled mind will always resist the free soul. But resistance is the sign you're getting closer. Jung believed the goal wasn't perfection. It was integration, to bring the saboteur out of the shadows and let it rest. Let it evolve. Let it finally trust that it doesn't have to run your life anymore. You've started to wake up. You're asking real questions. You're pulling away from things that once felt like home. You're noticing how uncomfortable peace feels. You're realizing that most of your choices weren't actually yours. But just when you start to break free, the world pulls harder. Carl Jung understood this dynamic too well. An individual can heal, but society needs you to stay controlled. Because a healed mind is unpredictable. It questions. It doesn't obey blindly. It doesn't fit in. And that threatens the very systems built on silent obedience. Think about how the modern world operates. You're encouraged to be yourself, as long as yourself fits the mold. Express your feelings, but don't be emotional. Chase your dreams, but don't disrupt the system. Be strong, but not too assertive. Be kind, even when you're being disrespected. Be positive, even when you're breaking inside. These aren't values. These are control scripts. They don't want you to think. They want you to perform. Jung would call this mass neurosis, a collective sickness disguised as normality. We live in a culture that praises burnout as ambition, numbness as maturity, perfectionism as responsibility, and conformity as goodness. You're rewarded for staying asleep. You're punished for waking up. Try saying, "I don't believe in that." You're labeled difficult. Try refusing to fake smiles. You're called negative. Try leaving toxic environments. You're called selfish. Try setting boundaries. You're told you're too sensitive. And the scariest part? You start believing them. This is how the outer world merges with your inner saboteur. It doesn't even need to control you directly. It just keeps placing mirrors in front of your trauma until you regulate yourself. So you feel shame without anyone shaming you. You feel guilt without anyone blaming you. You feel fear without anyone threatening you. That's psychological control. And it works because it hides behind the mask of society. Let's break it down. Media constantly floods you with ideas of who you should be. Beautiful, rich, productive, happy, desirable, moral. You're not taught to explore your mind. You're taught to compare it, to filter it, to commodify it. Schools train compliance, not curiosity. They reward memorization, not imagination. They shame mistakes rather than encouraging questions. Work culture equates worth with output. You are only as valuable as what you produce. Rest is seen as weakness. Boundaries are labeled as laziness. Family systems often pass down unhealed patterns: emotional suppression, performance love, guilt-based loyalty. And social labels: introvert, extrovert, empath, achiever, rebel, become prisons if you cling to them too tightly. You start asking not, "Who am I becoming?" but Am I still fitting into the label I was given? Jung believed we are meant to individuate, to become whole by integrating all our parts. But the system wants the opposite. It wants you fragmented, productive but numb, kind but boundaryless, smart but obedient, creative but conforming. Because whole people don't buy into shame. Don't stay where they aren't valued. Don't follow leaders who lie. Don't worship systems that devalue their humanity. That's why the moment you start healing, you will be misunderstood. People will say you've changed. You've become selfish, cold, distant, dramatic. But in truth, you're just becoming you. The you that existed before the world shaped you. The you that was silenced. The you that stopped trusting yourself. The you that still remembers freedom. Let's look at one real-world example. A woman grows up in a culture that values submission. She's taught to be soft-spoken, agreeable, accommodating. When she starts going to therapy, she learns to set boundaries, to say no, to ask for what she needs. Suddenly, people around her call her difficult. Her family says she's changed. Her friends say she's intense. But Jung would say she hasn't become intense. She's become real. And reality, especially emotional truth, terrifies those still stuck in the dream. The system thrives on your confusion, on your guilt, on your silence. But Jung believed that even the most controlled mind has a spark left, a fire that resists, a voice that says, "This isn't me. This isn't real. There's more." You don't need permission to listen to that voice. You don't need proof. You don't need support. You only need courage. Because society might keep you sick. But healing? That's contagious too. You've seen the system. You've felt the programming. You've watched yourself shrink, obey, perform. Now comes the most terrifying and beautiful part. Taking your mind back. But first, a warning. Carl Jung would have given you himself. Freedom is not comfortable. It is not peaceful. It is not instantly rewarding. Freedom is chaotic. It is lonely. It is silent. Because when you remove all the voices that controlled you, for a while, there is nothing left. No script, no instruction, just you. And that is the hardest thing to face. That's not weakness. That's awakening. So, how do you begin? When you stop pretending, when you stop shaping yourself for others, you break the very system that conditioned you. And the more real you become, the less power control systems have over you. Because they can't manipulate someone who knows who they are. Let's look at one final example. A man grows up taught to never cry, never show emotion, always perform. He becomes successful, charismatic, respected. But inside, he's numb, disconnected, alone. One day, something breaks. A loss, a betrayal, a moment of silence. And in that moment, instead of numbing, he feels. He cries. He screams. He admits, "I'm not okay. I never was." And for the first time in his life, he's real. That moment, that's freedom. Not the kind you see in movies, but the kind that makes healing possible. Because here's the truth. You can't control a mind that's real. You can't silence a soul that remembers its power. You can't program someone who listens to their own voice. Carl Jung didn't want to fix you. He wanted you to remember yourself. The self before the programming, before the shame, before the obedience. Because that self is dangerous. Not in the violent sense, but in the truthful sense. A mind that has reclaimed itself can no longer be used. Not by society, not by trauma, not even by the scared parts of itself. So today, ask yourself, where am I still obeying what I no longer believe? Where am I still silencing what wants to be heard? Where am I still performing someone else's script and calling it me? You don't have to become anyone. You only have to remember who you were before they told you who to be. And if this video stirred something in you, if you felt seen, called out, or awakened, then don't let it end here. This is your signal to pause, to breathe, to question, and slowly to break the pattern. Drop a comment. The control ends with me, because it does, right now, if you're ready. Like if this video shook something loose. Comment your breakthrough. Let's start a rebellion of thought. Subscribe to Psychatic for raw, emotional, mind-breaking truths. Support us with a super thanks if this changed your perspective. The more we wake up, the less power control has over us.